Okay. Again, I've muted everybody. So for the speakers, when it's your turn to speak, if you could just make sure that you unmute yourself. Welcome to this session on the 2020 Labor and Employment Relations Association annual research volume on reimagining the governance of work and employment. It's a little bit sad that we weren't all able to get together in person, but this conference is just going so well, I feel like, in the virtual online format. And so I have no doubt that this session will go as smoothly as the other ones that I was at yesterday. I hope that you're all safe and healthy wherever you are in the world, and just thanks for joining us. This volume was, Ariel Avgar encouraged me to take on editing this volume that was really intended to try and reimagine some classic approaches to the governance and regulation of work and employment, especially given the changing nature of work and the changing nature of employment relationships, and sort of the digitization of work, and some of the other challenges that are occurring especially in liberal market democracies around the world. And so the volume itself has 11 chapters from 20 different contributors. There's also a section of the volume that has a set of discussants, a union side professional, management side professional, and an academic. And I think I saw two of the discussants, Bill Dirksen, who's now retired from Ford, on this in this meeting right now, and as well Lisa Jordan, who's with the United Steelworkers Union. So thank you to both of them for contributing to the volume. So there's a number of authors you aren't going to hear from today. If you're a member of LERA, you'll be mailed a copy of the volume in late summer or early fall. If you are not a member of LERA, you can purchase it for it's basically cost recovery through Cornell University Press. So today we're going to hear from 5 of the authors of 5 of the chapters, and this is a symposium session format, so I've asked them all to basically highlight 3 or 4 key contributions of their chapter, or a brief summary of the chapter, to give you enough that you would be interested in going and reading it when it comes out in the summer, fall, and then hopefully we will have time to have a conversation back and forth with some questions. So that's the structure of this session. I'm not going to introduce each of the speakers because I have uploaded in the online panel session a document that has all of the speakers' bios as well as the abstracts for their chapters. So you can go there and read it, read it if you want to know more about the speakers. And we're just going to go through in the order that they're listed on the program. So we're going to start with Nelson Lichtenstein. So Nelson, if you can just unmute yourself before you start.
Can you hear me? Okay. Hi. Hello there. I'm glad to be here. Well, my contribution to the volume edited by Dionne now seems like ancient history because it was written before the pandemic. But I think its historically inflected advocacy of sectorial bargaining actually makes this essay more relevant in June 2020, not less. As I have argued in a recent American Prospect and in other venues, health and safety issues in key sectors such as meatpacking, nursing homes, and warehouses can most effectively be resolved on a sectorial and tripartite basis, and not in terms of a single enterprise or workplace. And my chapter makes some of the following points, some which are very well established that they hardly require elaboration, others not so much. First, enterprise bargaining, of course, it seems to at pretty much a dead end because of the fissuring of the workforce, but also because of the intense hostility of management. However, at the same time, although some of us, and I think you alluded to this perhaps a little bit in your introduction, Diane, some of us like to exaggerate the technological and organizational differences between our time and, say, the 30s or even the 1960s and 70s, the heyday of collective bargaining in the US. I think the similarities are more important. at least for this historian, which is another way of explaining that a species of sectorial bargaining was on offer in the progressive era and the 1930s, and also, of course, abroad as well, because sectorial bargaining seemed a logical solution to the problems arising out of a capitalist economy that was hardly characterized. And here, historians like myself have I think, overemphasized this, and because it's so dramatic, but it was not simply characterized by oligopoly, bigness, Ford versus UAW. That was there, but that was not the absolute center of everything. Much economic activity in the first half of the 20th century took place in firms that were small, highly competitive, and sectorially well defined. So I offer some examples in my paper, and also of the response of liberals and laborites in this period. So in the progressive era, for example, wage boards in northern and western states it took place at about 12 of them. They were tripartite in character, and they were hardly stolid or sort of bureaucratic or sort of simply state activities. Historian Vivian Hart called the key figures in the DC board, which became famous as a result of the Atkins versus case where the minimum wage was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But the key figures in that board were, she called them conviction bureaucrats, very activist individuals who animated organization and gave voice to the women workers who were the prime constituency of these boards. And the initial impulse for sectorial bargaining and state-sponsored bargaining, that sort, was because the workers presumably were not exactly citizens, i.e. they were women, or there was child labor. And some of the AFL tended to be against that. However, today, here's the similarity. Today, there's a vast numbers of American workers who really are not quite citizens. They're either immigrants, undocumented, or they are in such authoritarian and repressive states or cities that really they don't enjoy the kind of citizenship rights we think of as attendant of a modern industrial liberal democracy. So I think that's another reason, another similarity between then and now, which makes sectorial bargaining and these wage boards I think relevant and useful. And the New Deal and later, we think of that as, again, as fixated on the bargaining between large corporations and what will become large unions in the Wagner, supervised by the Wagner Act and other sources. But here again, labor scholars, including, I'll just mention some, they may not be familiar to you, but I think in historical circles they are, Andrew Wender Cohen, Mark Berenberg, and Kate Andrus, you may have heard of her, have been making the argument that those people who framed the original New Deal labor legislation very much were thinking in terms of sectorial bargaining. The Codes of Fair Competition in the NRA period was in fact sectorial. The Fair Labor Standards Act, as Kate has recently made the argument, provided for sectorial bargaining and different kinds of minimum wages, by the way, in different industries and regions, and these would be arrived at by bargaining. But this would all take place under the umbrella and the authority and the supervision of state agencies, which were sort of, this is one of their problems, of course, they assume these would be pro-labor. Now, so there's a kind of both historical precedent, and I think also given the nature of the sort of the highly competitive, this was the thing, the New Dealers were very worried about the what they call the cutthroat competition, competition in terms of labor costs. Well, that's true today, obviously. One of the big obstacles for unionization in the service industries, of course. So that there's a historical precedent based not just on kind of we did it before, but I think also on the structures of capitalism then and now. Let me say that, there's one, how much time do I have left? Any time? Another minute?
You have a minute and a half.
Okay, I just make one point. One of the huge issues today in terms of the structure, in the US anyway, in terms of the structure of labor law reform, is that we have, blue, liberal, left liberal cities and even states, but the labor law is federal, and the big problem is preemption. That is, if the city of San Francisco or something tries to pass a modification of the Wagner Act, this will instantly be struck down by the courts because that is it's preempted by the federal government. At least that's in terms of the Wagner Act or the itself. However, when it comes to minimum wage laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act, this gives the latitude for states and cities to, well, $15 here and $12.50 there, but it's not just the amount of money, it's also, lunch breaks here or health and safety committees there. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, preemption doesn't apply. So if we have a species of sectorial bargaining, that is, in which the state sets up a new set of industrial commissions or wage boards, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, then this is constitutionally permitted. And we're sort of seeing this right now, both in New York State, where there's a sectorial bargaining law was put into effect covering fast food. I think AB 5 in California that tries to transform Uber drivers into real workers, and I think has elements of sectorial bargaining for that gig economy. I think that this is both it's a constitutionally permitted road forward. I'll just make the final point. I won't try to resolve it. The big problem, of course, with sectorial bargaining under wage boards is what's the issue? The issue of institutional unionism. What is the mechanism whereby workers will be brought together in an institution which can give voice to their concerns in a permanent fashion? And of course, neither the wage boards back in the progressive era or today have resolved that problem. There are some attempts to do it, but it's clearly the issue in front of us. How do you get a permanent, a dues flow? How do you get a leadership structure? How do you get democratic participation? I'll stop at this. There's some answers to that. Maybe someone might want to bring that up, but that's the major dilemma of facing this new form of bargaining. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nelson. Right on time. And just to Nelson's point about sort of the historical approach and putting things into context, Lisa's discussant chapter is actually titled "What is Old is New Again." And so, and also to the other discussant, Sarah Slynn, she actually talks a lot about and interacts with Nelson's chapter on sectoral approaches to workplace regulation. So up next is Greg Distelhorst.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I was so pleased to be able to contribute to the LERA research volume. And, for me, one remarkable development of the 21st century has been this emergence of a very unusual kind of labor regulator, the multinational corporation. Most people think that all multinational corporations do is seek profit in every corner of the globe. And yes, they certainly do that. But, many of these same corporations also claim to do everything that a labor regulator does: setting labor standards, inspecting workplaces, issuing citations for labor violations. We do that too. And these aren't some obscure companies you've never heard of. In fact, these are the most successful corporations in several major industries. These are multinationals like Nike, Apple, Starbucks. Even Walmart is out there claiming to be a global labor regulator. And for me, this is a little bit like an NHL goalie showing up to arrange the flowers at your wedding. So, I know you're the best in the world at this one thing, stopping pucks. You have all this specialized equipment, experience, training. You're so good at stopping pucks. Are you really going to be good at also arranging flowers too? None of us want the goalie to be the main flower arranger, but in the world we live in, they're going to do it anyway. And so perhaps it's worth figuring out whether they are any good at it. So in my chapter for the volume, I summarize what we've learned from about 2 decades of research into multinational enterprises acting as labor regulators in their global supply chains. And today I'll highlight just 2 points from that research that seem to me to be the most salient things to emerge from that. So first off, the most important thing to know is that These multinational corporations, if you read their codes of conduct, they're going to describe the labor standards in their supply chains as the minimum required for some factory or farm to be involved manufacturing their products or producing the inputs for their products, if you're in an industry like chocolate or coffee. Over and over again, when researchers analyze actual labor compliance data collected by the multinational enterprises themselves, by the way, they found that none of these supply chains get even near full compliance. There's often very high levels of violations, even after these factories or farms are exposed to many rounds of inspections. This is really the most consistent finding, and I think just the most important stylized fact for everyone to internalize here. And we've seen it in a variety of industries, starting out in clothing and shoes, but then also in toys, agricultural products, and electronics. It's interesting though, despite that really well-established stylized fact, one thing we still don't have a great handle on in the research is what the impact is of these multinational interventions. So in other words, what working conditions would have been like in the absence of multinationals acting as labor regulators. It's just very challenging to measure that. But I think you might reasonably say, since what we'd really like is to get some sort of minimum level of compliance in place, and we know we don't get close to that minimum level of compliance, maybe we don't even care about that impact. All right, to the extent that multinationals do anything well as labor regulators, the evidence is primarily about improving outcomes rather than any sort of processes of worker representation. I think there's a lot of ongoing work in entrepreneurship in this area about improving processes of representation. There's not a ton of evidence yet that this delivers tangible results. That's my first point. My second point is that to the extent that there's some unexplored frontier in this space, frontier both in the scholarly sense of things to learn about, but also in the management practice sense of places where more experimentation could make these systems more effective, it's about exploiting the things that make multinationals distinctive when they're moonlighting as labor regulators, and that is their commercial relationship to the workplaces that they are nominally regulating. So unlike government regulators, when multinationals pretend to be labor regulators, they're simultaneously the customers of the firms that they're ostensibly trying to regulate. This creates an opportunity to create reward structures for good behavior. So here are some things that I think multinationals could do to make themselves more effective labor regulators. They could, for example, offer more attractive payment terms to suppliers that were able to comply with minimum standards. They could provide them with more information and better access to forecasting information to allow them to do production planning better. And perhaps the simplest one, although it turns out to be hard to, can be challenging to implement in practice, they can create price premiums that pass directly through to payroll. This is the kind of thing you see in the Fair Food Program in Florida in a US domestic supply chain, but you could also do that in international supply chains. So in conclusion, I'll just say, business's main thing is to make money. That's what all that specialized hockey goalie equipment is there primarily to do. But because of that, they respond to incentives that affect their ability to make money. These can be new laws like the French duty of care law that make them liable for what happens in their supply chains, or these can be activist campaigns that threaten their brand image. There may, in addition, be some win-win interventions that academics help to highlight. There's a really nice recent study, it's out in 2020 by Nicholas Lolo and Dara O'Rourke, showing the presence of some really low-hanging fruit in the incentive systems of garment manufacturers working in a global supply chain, where they're showing that you can raise worker wages while simultaneously making the factory more profitable. There may be some opportunities for that, but all that said, I think if you want to ensure compliance with some minimum labor standards in global supply chains, the accumulated research says that the current state of affairs, multinationals behaving as labor regulators as they currently do, won't get you all the way there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg. That was an excellent overview. And there's, for those of you who have been kind of following, Kelly Pike and Greg have been putting together, and others have been putting together a series of sessions at LERA over the last couple of years. And many of those sessions were on yesterday about this. And Greg's chapter coming in the volume is a really great overview of some of the, like you said, the stylized facts and some of the key findings of that literature over the last 2 decades. So next up is Michael Maffie is going to present on behalf of himself and his co-authors, Rachel, Aleks, and Tina Saksida.
Hi, morning everybody, if it's morning where you're at. Our chapter looks at the role of collective bargaining in the digitized workplace. And there's been an enormous amount of discussion about the changing technological landscape of modern work. And in this chapter, we try to set out to do a few things. First, we discuss how advances in algorithmic management and employer surveillance is changing the organization work. Second, we draw on past technological changes to try to place these technologies in the larger arc of history. And finally, we examine the role of institutional actors like unions and the state in shaping our technological future. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to focus on that last point, how institutions can shape the emergence of technology on workers. Now, we mainly focus on two actors, labor unions and the state, and how they can blunt the worst excesses of the emergence of intelligent machines and how they can be used to advance employer surveillance. Now, we identify 5 areas, and this is what I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about where unions can use collective worker power to shape the types of emerging technology and to push back against some of the challenges that we're seeing. Now, first, we think that labor unions can repurpose technology for the purposes of building worker power. Now, recent strikes like the national May 1st Instacart strike in the US, Uber's strike before their IPO, and many others were built using the power of social media and handheld internet devices. Now, research has found that labor organizations around the world are connecting with people through Facebook, through Twitter, and other social media platforms to try to share people's experiences at work in an otherwise disconnected industry. And the challenges that people initially experience are then connected together, and people start to recognize that the challenges that they have are not just about a failure in the app. It's about an endemic element of this kind of work. This allows labor unions to organize workers in remote locations and coordinate labor actions across vast distances. Second, labor unions can negotiate for individual skill assessments and transfers within organizations for individuals who could be displaced by technology in the short term. Now, unions won't be able to prevent all instances of technological displacement, but these steps can help blunt the worst effects of introducing new technology in the workplace. And third, we look at how unions can develop digital tools to help workers organize and fight back against aggressive employer tactics. For example, Turk Opticon is a Google Chrome plugin you just install in your browser. And it was designed by a partnership between academics and Amazon Mechanical Turk workers to try to help these workers avoid abusive customers, because Amazon Mechanical Turk workers weren't allowed to rate customers. And this meant that they had no idea if they would be working with someone who would engage in abusive practices. Well, the Chrome plugin allows workers to pool their collective experiences and identify challenging customers. We see this in other areas of the platform economy as well, like Driver's Seat, which is a driver co-op to try to help workers identify the best places to work so they're not drawn into trying to chase a surge that they'll just lose money on. And so in the spirit of Turk Opticon, unions have the institutional resources and expertise to develop their own digital tools that could help recruit new members who are new to unions and help insulate workers from unexpected exchanges at work. For collective bargaining and the process of bargaining, we think can help clarify opaque work systems. When workers are managed by algorithms, workers are rarely informed about the exact rules that they're required to follow. And sometimes these rules can be used against them, right? Uber drivers are never told their minimum performance cutoff. They're just told you're getting close to being deactivated. Instacart was pocketing people's tips and because they weren't including them in the receipts. And so bargaining over the rules of the algorithms is an area where it could create a win-win situation, because this is an instance where platforms that wish to engage in ethical practices and try to build relationships with workers are going to be able to clarify the rules that are actually guiding these digital workplaces. And finally, we think unions can negotiate for limitations on the gathering of data. Similar to the limitations for contents and access to personnel files, unions can negotiate the limits on who is allowed to review these materials and what can actually be collected. Now, within this chapter, we also go into the question of how the state can play into shaping the types of technologies that emerge, things like a robot tax and universal basic income. And in the instances of time, I'm going to set those aside, but if you have questions about them, happy to get into them in sort of the question and answer period. These are a few of the issues that we cover in the chapter. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions about this, about our work.
Thank you, Michael. One of the things I really loved about this chapter is that they really do talk a lot. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how the robots are coming for our jobs, and that's been since, of course, historians can tell us that that's been a conversation for a while, and they really try and talk about, you know, what's the evidence, is this likely, as well as using the idea of how technology can actually help collective action and unions and organizing. And in some of the discussant commentaries, there's actually a lot of discussion about how unions have actually used some of these tools. So both in that chapter as well as in Lisa Jordan's discussant commentary, they engage with that a lot. So up next is Jason Spicer. Jason.
Hi, Dionne. Thank you and good morning, everyone, or potentially good afternoon. I am one of 3 authors on this next piece. My co-authors are Robert Manduca, who is at Michigan Sociology, and Tamara Kay at Notre Dame in Global Affairs and Sociology. And the title is National Living Wage Movements in a Regional World, The Fight for 15 in the United States. And I assume everyone is quite familiar at this point with the Fight for 15, which over the last 8 years has become the latest iteration of a living wage campaign. And obviously, living wage campaigns, particularly in liberal market democracies, have a long history and have long been derided by some as a poor substitute for traditional informal collective bargaining. But the reality is this current iteration has been remarkably successful and scale shifted, to use obviously the term of Sarah Soule at Stanford, from what has historically been a localized approach into a really national movement seeking to achieve a national wage floor. And what we wanted to do was look at a couple of issues related to that scale shift. I am an economic geographer and an urban planner, and one of the chief insights from that world of scholarship is we live in a regional world. And obviously we have regional and metropolitan labor markets. The costs vary by region quite significantly, particularly in a large federal heterogeneous country like the United States. So we wanted to create some simple empirics to address a couple of concerns for the Fight for 15 today. And one is about the level. Is $15 too high? Are there some regions in the United States where the local cost structure and the components of the cost of living don't warrant, even after accounting for differences in household type locally, where it just would be economically harmful? 2, the nature, not just the level in terms of $15, but the nature of local costs. What drives local household costs? And specifically, is this really a story of housing, right? And where it's simply insanely expensive to live and raise a family in places like the Bay Area and New York. And the concern there is in naturally supply constrained housing markets, you might have an issue where the gains will simply become like the dog chasing its own tail, because you have inelastic housing markets that will eat up those wage gains because it won't induce additional construction. And then finally, we were concerned with how these local economic issues would interact with the politics of scale shift and preemption. So Nelson mentioned earlier the issue of federal preemption. We were more concerned with the issue of state preemption of cities' abilities to enact higher living wage policies, right? And we were wondering if those first 2 issues about cost structure were at play, right? Is it an issue in a state like Illinois where $15 may be a decent number or an appropriate number for Chicago, but might be seen as too high in some rural labor market areas of the state, therefore driving blowback? So what we found in answer to those questions is we looked at economic output numbers as well as Economic Policy Institute, EPI, numbers on local living wage components. We found that there are virtually no metropolitan areas in the United States where $15 appears to be too high to support even a single working adult. There are certainly none where it's too high to support anyone who is a working adult with dependents. We also looked at 2 working adults alone and with children and found the same result. We also found, using some crude BEA data, some crude metrics, that almost every metropolitan area has enough output to support a $15 an hour wage for their population, which is consistent with most of the evidence that we're getting thus far that don't support the notion that this is going to drive employment losses in certain areas thus far. In terms of the different drivers of affordability, housing is a driver in some areas, but not all, right? And there are many areas for which costs like childcare, transit, and healthcare play a far greater role in driving household expenses, right? So that point about, is this simply going to be eaten up by inelastic housing markets, outside of a handful of places doesn't seem to be the case. And then finally, we looked at the correlation between state preemption of local living wage laws and intrastate variance in those cost metrics I just went through, wondering if perhaps states that have higher internal variation were the ones where there was more preemption activity. And we found that there was no relationship, right? So that's not what's happening, right? So what did we conclude? Well, we think that the goals of the Fight for 15 are great and necessary, but not sufficient on their own. We argue that in some regions, $15 may actually be too low. And then furthermore, given the nature in terms of the specific drivers of unaffordability for households in other regions, they should probably be paired with contextually appropriate complementing strategies, such as affordable housing construction, employee ownership programs, social welfare service provision, transit programs, given the very specific nature of the cost structure in those places. And obviously, unions and other labor market institutions have historically been partners and have an operating history with these types of strategies. And we think that the future of the Fight for 15 accordingly is one that involves these types of complementing strategies in order to achieve its goals at a national scale.
Thank you so much, Jason. And I love this chapter, and I hope that you do something similar in Canada. I think this is one of those chapters that really actually is starting to make us think about sort of the regional differences that exist, especially in federations, and how there can be possible differences across different regions that matter. And I think as well too, this can help us start to understand a little bit maybe the never-ending minimum wage debate and why we do find differences, for instance, in the empirical research across Canada and the United States. And so I think that this is one of those chapters that's starting to actually highlight some of the other factors that we should be looking at, instead of always sort of looking at whether or not minimum wage just is affecting employment growth. And those kinds of outcomes. So our last speaker is Kourtney Koebel. Kourtney.
Okay, thank you, Dionne. So I co-authored the chapter with Dionne, and we wrote on the guaranteed basic income. So I'll first start off with just a basic definition of what a basic income is. And it's just an unconditional income transfer from the government to individuals that's sufficient to meet basic needs. And there's two main variants of a basic income that often get talked about in policy circles. The first is a universal basic income, or UBI. And that is just a transfer where every individual receives the exact same benefit regardless of income. So somebody earning $1,000 in the labor market and somebody earning $1 million in the labor market each get the basic income, the exact same amount. The second type is called a negative income tax. And in that design, the benefit is reduced with income. So as your income or employment income increases, your guaranteed basic income decreases. And so it's really targeted to those that need it most. And in the chapter, we talk about how the UBI, or the universal version of a basic income, due to its really large upfront costs, is not feasible for any country to kind of implement. And so we think that the most feasible design is a negative income tax. However, in the chapter, we also outlined a third way that you could design a basic income. And basically what we propose is a hybrid program that blends a basic income with an earnings subsidy. And so an example of an earnings subsidy is the Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States, which is a fairly large program. And so the reason that we blend the basic income with this earnings subsidy is that we believe the hybrid design helps overcome major concerns that politicians and voters have about work disincentives that we argue have ultimately prevented the implementation of a basic income in any liberal market democracy. So the goal of our chapter on the basic income guarantee is really to outline and address the political economy issues associated with the design of a basic income in Canada specifically, but many of the arguments that we make will also apply to other countries as well, including the US. We also provide a very detailed proposal on how to design a revenue neutral and what we think is politically feasible basic income. So in the chapter, we identified two main concerns of politicians, policymakers, and voters that have ultimately prevented the implementation of a basic income. The first is the cost of a national-wide basic income and the associated tax increases that may be required to finance it. And the second is, again, this concern about work disincentives and concerns about fairness and reciprocity. And so we distinguished between both real and perceived work disincentives. And we think that the work disincentive, this concern about work disincentives really matters because especially particularly in Canada, we have two major basic income programs, right? We have the Canada Child Benefit, which is an unconditional transfer to families with children. And we have old age security and the guaranteed income supplement, which are income transfers to seniors. And so these two groups are largely thought of as the deserving poor. But what's missing currently is a major income transfer to help the working age population. And so we say this group is usually thought of as the non-deserving poor because they're expected to work in order to get assistance. So this concern about work disincentives really comes out of neoclassical theory from economics, which predicts that a basic income will reduce incentives to work as it allows individuals to purchase more leisure or buy more time out of the labor market. However, in terms of empirical evidence, there is not a lot of evidence that actually supports the predictions of this theory, that people will leave the labor force to live on their basic income, both in terms of the evidence that comes out of the pilot studies on basic incomes, which is problematic, but also evidence that's collected among other income transfer programs that aren't necessarily basic incomes, but are quite substantial in size and more permanent than a pilot. So we don't really see a lot of empirical evidence supporting this prediction of adverse labor supply effects. However, because no country has implemented a full basic income policy, it is really unknown what the real labor supply effects of a basic income will be. Another insight that we have in our chapter is that both the neoclassical theory and the concern about basic income policy generating work disincentives is based on problematic assumptions about work. And so this comes out of of the neoclassical tradition, which is that work is a disutility or a curse, and that people only work to obtain income. But as we know from research coming out of industrial relations and OB and industrial psychology, people work for other reasons than simply to earn an income, right? There are social benefits, the fulfilling one's goals, and self-actualization. And so in the chapter, we also argue that it is this really prevailing assumption or belief about work as disutility specifically that we think has prevented the implementation of a basic income for working age individuals. And so because it's really hard to now change this deeply ingrained assumption about work as disutility, and given that politicians and voters are really concerned about work disincentives, this is why we include an earnings subsidy in order for recipients to receive the maximum benefit of our basic income proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Kourtney. And I know in many countries right now, also the basic income is getting a lot of debate in the popular press, and so it's also timely. So that was 5 of the chapters, contributors that you've heard from. Just a brief overview of some of the other chapters coming out in the volume. Morley Gunderson has a chapter on how we think about labor regulation as we move into more non-standard types of work. The current labor regulation framework is really structured around standard work. We have a chapter on social partnership in European countries in the aftermath of the Great Recession. We have a chapter on immigration and employment relations and the interaction with the state. We have a chapter on emancipation in the idea of transnational labor law. We have a chapter on guaranteed jobs and it reviews an actual implementation of a jobs program that was undertaken in Canada. And we also have a chapter on employee stock ownership as a pattern for the online economy. And as I said, 3 discussants as well who read the whole volume. Thank you to all of them, and engage with the different chapters in different ways. And I think just before we go to questions, I would just, one of the things that I think that the chapter has a lot of strengths, but it also has a lot of weaknesses. And I think in some ways the strengths and weaknesses come from the same thing, which is that it's really about ideas. It's about reimagining, drawing on empirical work, drawing upon the kinds of institutions we have, but also trying to reimagine some of our assumptions and beliefs about work in the labor market and the way that we regulate. While understanding that, what is old is new again as well. Some of these ideas are actually not new either, but it's about sort of bringing them back into the policy debate. And in Lisa Jordan's discussant chapter, she actually has a quote by Marx that I think is just perfect for summarizing the strengths and weaknesses of this volume. And the quote is that ideas never lead beyond the established situation. They only lead beyond the ideas of the established situation. Ideas can accomplish absolutely nothing. To become real, ideas require people to apply a practical force. And so I would also sort of say that, this volume is just that first step, and to make it actually real, and to sort of see some of these ideas into application, we might have to do a lot more work. So with that, I would like to open it up to some questions. I know some people have been engaging with the authors and some questions have been answered already, so I might not go back into those, but if anybody has any questions, you can put up your hand or just turn on your microphone and ask them now, and we'll collect a few and then have the authors respond to them. So Kourtney, there's a question for you. Can you point to good surveys of how life looks differently for working class people when a UBI is implemented? Are there any other, there's a question for Jason. Why would we expect states with high level of variation to be more likely to preempt local action? Shouldn't states with a high level variation in cost of living be more open to differing standards across the state? And I think
Well,
the
do
other,
you want me to answer that now? I was just going to answer in the comments to the side, but I can.
yeah, answer it, should just answer it now.
Okay, yeah. That's a great question. The reality in a number of states, though, has been the perception and anecdotal evidence that it's been the reverse, that there's been a concern that allowing these higher cost regions to push for higher wages at the city and then shift to attempt to get it at the state level as well. So some of these movements have been not stopping at the city. They've then pushed to the state level, would have negative consequences for those lower cost regions. So you're right, if this was simply a phenomenon that remained highly localized and it was simply city by city, yes, that would be the working prior. But what's happened as there's been this scale shift and scale up from the city to the state, and as partners in the movement have sought to get state level wage floors increased, there's been this pushback in a number of states, if that makes sense.
Kourtney, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of the early pilots that were done that were basic income pilots, we're really just looking at how people responded in terms of their labor supply. And this is because that early literature was really dominated by economists. I would say the most relevant, the most recent pilot, which came out of Ontario, although it was canceled by the Ford government, they were able to collect some data, and they did examine some questions beyond just labor supply. And so they did see that people's lives were really improved when they, and I don't think that this really is a surprise, when they received the basic income, they were less stressed. They did participate more in the labor market. Some people returned to school. And so it really seems to have positive effects on mental health, physical health. But yeah, I would definitely look, if you're interested, look into that Ontario, the results of the Ontario pilot. And in particular, there's a report that came out of McMaster University on that.
Thank you, Kourtney. Any other questions from the audience?
So just to that last chat, the comment I got, I would say, do not look at any of the old pilots then, just look at the results of the Ontario pilot.
I'm going to actually put a question then to the entire panel. Could you just say, in a minute or two, how in the current moment, with COVID and, sort of how that's affected the world of work and the kinds of challenges we've seen from that, as well as the massive mobilization against institutional and systemic racism that's happening across the world really right now. Maybe it's not relevant to both, or maybe it is, but if you could just, a minute or two about how, because you didn't write your chapters sort of in this current moment, you were all done prior to that. My introduction was because it was written a bit later, I was able to try and bring COVID into it, but if you could just take a minute, maybe we'll start with Greg, I'll go out in order of on my screen here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the pandemic and its economic effects have been very, I think, humbling for me in that a lot of the work that I think about labor compliance and global supply chains assumes that there's this massive market demand for light manufacturers, and that emerging markets can kind of get on the train and get involved in manufacturing, bring people out of agriculture into these somewhat, higher value added occupations. And so, what COVID has revealed is that there's sort of like all this discussion about working conditions has given way to the first order condition of, oh, do these jobs exist anymore? To what extent are different multinationals honoring or not honoring the orders they've already placed at these factories? And from the multinationals' perspective, it's also a matter of they just pure self-interest, they don't want some of these enterprises to disappear in the pandemic, because eventually demand is going to come back. How do we keep these businesses alive? So those have come to the forefront, and really, at least, you know, with the kind of research partners that I work with, some of these other questions have given way to just how do we preserve these enterprises' existence in the first place.
Okay, Michael.
So I think that both of these major shifts are presenting questions of how technology is connecting people in new ways and how that affects how they work. Some of the early work in the area of social networks and organizing were coming out of the Arab Spring and the use of Twitter and other social media to illuminate situations and to try to connect people and understand conditions on the ground that that were not possible in previous eras. And so I think that as labor unions, and we think of collective labor actions like Facebook's walkout, the New York Times virtual sick out, that these are raising the level of labor consciousness and trying to discover new ways that people can connect in light of the falling communication costs. The one thing that I think is, while our chapter is optimistic, we need to temper that optimism, because in previous eras of social movements that are powered by technology, we see intervention by other actors. Like during the Arab Spring, governments began trying to intercept communications, flooding communication channels. Employers today will keep track of what websites people visit. They scan your email, they can scan your email. And so while there seems to be some optimism about the ways in which technology can connect people and try to build new forms of labor organizations, I think there are also some challenges that are not far away that we're going to need to study in the very near future.
Thank you. Jason.
Did you say me? Yeah. So I will focus my comments not on COVID-19, but on the mobilizations around race and racism, because I think that has a greater potentially impact on movements like the Fight for 15. Right. And obviously, I'm sure everyone on the call is intimately familiar with the work of Adolph Reed. Right. And I was just private messaging with Ken Jacobs about how much of this regional resistance to higher wages is really about race. Right. And how much of it is about rural white people and a rural consciousness. Catherine Kramer, of course, the Wisconsin sociologist looking at regional economic resentment. How much of that is really what this is about? And I think the renewed attention on racial injustice, including economic injustice, not just criminal and police systems injustice, is going to be potentially a pivotal moment for movements like the Fight for 15. And either, you know, I want to be an optimist and say that this will result in less of a pushback and more under higher wage requirements of urban areas, where urban sometimes is code for Black, still even today, right? But, you know, like everyone else, I'm a social scientist and I'm a realist, right? And it may not go that way, right? And this tension may become worse, right? And none of us have a crystal ball. But nonetheless, I think these movements are going to, and have run into each other already, right? And there are already linkages between them over the last number of years. And now those linkages are going to, I think, become even a more critical part in the public dialogue about what the wage floor should be.
Thank you, Jason. Kourtney?
So for me, what the pandemic has revealed is really how easy it is for people to fall into poverty through no fault of their own. And I wonder to what extent other people also believe this and are recognizing this, and whether they're recognizing this, because I think part of the reason we do not have a basic income guarantee is because of this belief that some people in poverty, it's because of some kind of moral flaw about those individuals, and people don't tend to recognize the environmental factors and obstacles that people have to overcoming or coming out of poverty. And so what's interesting is that when you compare across the income support policies that came out of Canada and across the US, I did find the Canadian response to be very problematic, and it took this, speaking of work disincentives, it was primarily like the design of the Canadian income support program was really based on concerns about work disincentives. And so Dionne and I are working on another paper related to this right now. The problem with that design, I'll just briefly describe what it was. So the CERB, or the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, was an application-based program that you had to be unemployed to receive. Whereas the US, it was kind of like this negative income tax transfer that was just distributed to all Americans, kind of no questions asked. So the problem with the Canadian approach is that because of this concern about work disincentives and not wanting people who are working to stop working, is that low-income people did not have the ability to say no to work that they believed was unsafe. And so this like concern that we have about work disincentives, that's prevented the basic income, also prevented an equitable response to designing income transfers for COVID. And so I find this really deeply ingrained assumption about work disincentives and assumption about workers' utility as really problematic. But I hope that COVID would change that perspective of people. But I worry that as time goes on, it will just kind of be forgotten.
So that can you hear me? Can I?
Yeah, Nelson, you're next, so you go ahead.
Oh, well, one of the things that's sort of been brought up in a number of things. In the United States, anyway, we've sort of never lacked for social movements. We're very good at social movements. The United States is, and obviously, most recently we have extremely great manifestation of that. And going all the way back to lots of things, Occupy and many, and even during the pandemic, there's a certain kind of discontent with health and with the various workplace situations. The problem in the U.S. has always been the institutionalization of these social movements in some fashion, and obviously this applies to labor, and I alluded to that myself. And so I think that's the thing. And so there was a kind of a comment about sort of a default view of how legislation or social change takes place, which is that you have a sort of social movement which creates a kind of pressure, and then you end up with legislation, and then that legislation then helps sustain the social movement. That does happen, but I think a lot less than and less and because America has so many veto points in legislation. One of the things about that I see putting the reason that sectorial bargaining and state and local activism is that you will get the state itself, the center of liberalism in America today, is the state, cities and states. We have this very polarized blue-red situation, and so we have to take advantage of that. And I think that you sort of have, I mentioned in a chat, this dialectical relationship between state activity, creating a venue in which organization can then take place, and that's what I see. The problem that's what I see that these whether it's sectorial boards or other state kinds of activity take place. And I would like, so that's one point. If we just wait around or create a new series of activist organizers to create social movements, and then we'll create institutions, that's a long, hard path. It can be done. It has been done in the past in heroic moments, but we need this dialectical relationship with the state, and that's always been the case wealth, and obviously the civil rights movement, and perhaps the current movement in terms of Black Lives Matter. But institutionalization is important. That's the question of the day, and I wanted to just emphasize that.
Thank you, Nelson. And with that, actually, we ended right on time. So thank you all for joining us. This was a great conversation. If you have any questions, you can reach out to any of the speakers by email. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer other questions you have. Have a great rest of the conference.